So we get to factoring or selling of our accounts receivable now. And if you look in the various articles in this chapter, I have a real factoring company, just so you can see we're not making this up and that these things really do happen and we have to account for them. So you basically, companies use their receivables as a financing tool, and companies such as factoring companies will buy a company's receivables and give them cash up front, and of course there's a fee for that transaction. It basically shortens the operating cycle of, you make the sale, you send out a bill, you collect the cash, and you're done. Here you're getting the cash and you don't have to wait for your customers to pay. Okay, so there's a lot of arrangements for doing this, but there's two basic approaches. One is factoring, which is selling the receivables outright. The receivables come off of the books. And then the other is secured borrowing, which we get into assigning or pledging receivables as collateral for loans. Okay, so there's some terms here that are good to know. Let's see if I can get back to that. Okay, so you have to get the terminology down. You've got the company who has the receivables. They're either borrowing money, they're the assignor, the transferor, the seller of receivables. I'll tend to just use, if they're selling the receivables, I'll say they're selling them to a factor who's the buyer of the receivables. But anyway, so terminology is always good. There's, you have to treat the receivables similarly to if you were selling any other asset, like a piece of equipment. You remove any accounts that go with it. So with the equipment, you'd say, we take the equipment off, we take the accumulated depreciation off. Here, you take the receivables off the books, and any allowance accounts that go with them also come off the books. And chances are, as with equipment, there will be a gain or there'll be a loss on the transaction. Definitely a loss on this one. So in the past, factoring or selling the receivables was regarded as an indication that a company was in trouble. They were desperate for money, but now it's become more of common business practice and maybe even a best practice, because it may be more efficient to have a professional factoring company collect your receivables than to do it in-house. That's where you do your cost benefit. Okay, so you're selling your receivables to a third party. They're going to charge a fee for doing this. The seller gives up any rights to the future collections. Okay, the company that's selling the receivables, they'd say, okay, you're going to collect all the receivables. There will usually be a fee for the transaction. There's also, you have to account for the sales returns and allowances and cash or sales discounts which may be taken. And so there's usually an account set up to handle that. Okay, and then you have, as a separate item, the risk of non-collection, and that's where we get into selling the receivables with or without recourse, but we'll see how that works as we do the examples. The sales without recourse, these are just actual sales, they say in form and substance. The factor, the buyer of the receivables, assumes the risk of all the bad debts. They just buy a bunch of receivables. They say, yeah, we'll take, if people don't pay, well, that's our problem. And it would be the factoring company's problem. They can't come back to the seller and say, oh, so many people didn't pay, you got to pay us more. That doesn't happen. So the factor is assuming the risk of any credit losses. So that's without recourse. Sales with recourse, that means that the factor, the company who buys the receivables, can come back and say, well, 1,000 of these didn't pay, now you got to pay us. And so the seller, the company whose receivables they started out with, they keep the risk of bad debts when they're sold with recourse. And so I think the best thing to do would be to do a couple of examples, and then we'll see how this works.